The morning had begun with that peculiar quality of greyness which settles over the city in early November, when the sky hangs low and oppressive, and the air carries within it the damp chill of approaching winter. Eleanor Hartley stood before the towering glass edifice of Thornfield Industries, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, her fingers clutching the worn leather strap of her portfolio with a grip that betrayed her nervous anticipation. She was not by nature a woman given to excessive apprehension, yet there existed within her breast, at this moment, a tumultuous agitation that no amount of rational self-discourse could entirely subdue. She had been summoned, quite unexpectedly, to this temple of modern commerce, this monument to wealth and corporate ambition, for an interview that promised to alter the trajectory of her modest existence. The position, as outlined in the terse email that had arrived 3 days prior, was that of executive assistant to the chief executive officer, one Adrian Thornfield, whose name alone commanded a certain reverence in business circles, spoken always in tones that suggested both admiration and a species of fearful respect. Eleanor knew little of the man himself, save what the public record revealed: heir to a considerable fortune, architect of numerous successful ventures, and possessor of that ineffable quality which the modern world terms brilliance, but which often conceals beneath its glittering surface a multitude of less admirable characteristics. The lobby through which she now passed was a study in architectural intimidation, all soaring ceilings and cold marble, the very atmosphere seeming to whisper that here dwelt power and consequence, and that those who entered unbidden or unprepared did so at their peril. Eleanor's modest heels clicked against the polished floor with a sound that seemed to her unnaturally loud, as though announcing to all present her status as an interloper, a stranger to these rarefied precincts. She approached the reception desk, behind which sat a young woman whose beauty was of that artificial and carefully cultivated variety which requires both considerable expense and considerable time to maintain, and who regarded Eleanor with an expression of professional indifference that bordered on disdain. The preliminaries were conducted with efficient coldness. Eleanor was directed to the 43rd floor, where she was to present herself to one Miss Chen, who served as the gatekeeper to Mr. Thornfield's inner sanctum. The elevator ascended with a smoothness that seemed almost unnatural, and Eleanor watched the numbers climb with a feeling of mounting trepidation. She had prepared herself thoroughly for this interview, had researched the company's holdings and recent acquisitions, had rehearsed answers to probable questions with the dedication of an actress preparing for opening night. Yet, she could not shake the sensation that she was venturing into territory for which no amount of preparation could truly equip her. Miss Chen proved to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, whose severe expression and rigid posture suggested a lifetime spent in the service of exacting standards. She examined Eleanor with eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance, from the slight scuff on her left shoe to the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. Eleanor had dressed with care that morning, selecting her best suit, a charcoal grey ensemble that was neither fashionable nor entirely outdated, and which represented a significant portion of her limited wardrobe budget. Now, under Miss Chen's scrutiny, she felt acutely conscious of its inadequacies, of the way the fabric pulled slightly at the shoulders, of the buttons that were not quite the same shade as the cloth. There were others waiting, she observed, 3 young women and 1 young man, all possessed of that glossy confidence that comes from expensive educations and influential connections. They sat in the anteroom with the ease of those who have never doubted their place in the world, consulting their phones with practiced nonchalance, their attire speaking of boutiques Eleanor had only glimpsed from bus windows. She took her seat among them, feeling rather like a sparrow that has inadvertently flown into an aviary of tropical birds, conscious of her own plainness among their plumage. The wait was prolonged and nerve-wracking. One by one, the other candidates were summoned into the inner office, and one by one they emerged, some with expressions of satisfaction, others with barely concealed disappointment. Eleanor tried to occupy herself with a magazine from the stack on the table before her, but found she could not concentrate on the words, which seemed to blur and swim before her eyes. She thought of her small apartment across the river, of the bills that accumulated with depressing regularity, of the precarious nature of her current employment at a marketing firm that was, by all accounts, circling the drain of bankruptcy. She needed this position, needed it with an urgency that made her chest tight and her palms damp. At last, her name was called. Miss Chen appeared in the doorway and beckoned her forward with a gesture that was neither welcoming nor overtly hostile, merely perfunctory. Eleanor rose, gathered her portfolio, and followed the older woman through a corridor that seemed designed to impress upon visitors the wealth and power concentrated within these walls. The art that hung at intervals along the passage was of the sort that appears in museums, and the very carpet beneath her feet spoke of luxury she could scarcely imagine. The office into which she was finally ushered was vast, its far wall consisting entirely of glass that overlooked the city, spread below like a map of commerce and ambition. Behind an enormous desk of dark wood sat a figure who did not immediately raise his eyes from the document before him, and Eleanor was left to stand, uncertain and increasingly uncomfortable, while he continued his perusal of whatever claimed his attention. She used the interval to observe him covertly, noting the way his dark hair fell forward slightly as he bent over his work, the strong line of his jaw, the expensive cut of his clothing that managed to be both formal and somehow careless, as though he possessed such confidence in his position that he need not trouble himself overmuch with conventional presentation. When he did finally look up, Eleanor found herself the object of a gaze so penetrating and so utterly devoid of warmth that she felt as though she had been reduced to a specimen under glass, something to be examined and categorized and ultimately dismissed. Adrian Thornfield was, she realized with a small shock of recognition, younger than she had supposed, perhaps 35 at most, and possessed of features that might have been termed handsome, had they not been set in an expression of such supreme arrogance and cold assessment that any beauty they possessed was entirely negated by the unpleasant character they conveyed. He did not greet her, did not offer any of those small courtesies, that smooth social intercourse. Instead, he gestured with one hand toward a chair placed before his desk, a gesture that was neither invitation nor command, but something between the two, and Eleanor, her mouth suddenly dry, moved forward to seat herself. She placed her portfolio on her lap, her hands resting upon it, and waited for him to speak. The silence stretched. He continued to regard her with that unsettling intensity, and Eleanor felt color rising in her cheeks, felt that old familiar sense of indignation that always stirred within her when she encountered those who wielded their power with such casual disregard for the comfort of others. She had been raised to believe in the essential equality of all persons, in the dignity that belonged to every human soul, regardless of circumstance or fortune, and there was something in his manner that struck her as an affront to these principles. Finally, he spoke, and his voice, when it came, was deep and measured, with a quality that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. He inquired about her previous experience, her qualifications, her reasons for seeking this position, and Eleanor answered as best she could, conscious all the while of his eyes upon her, weighing and measuring. She explained her background in communications, her organizational skills, her ability to manage complex schedules and anticipate needs before they were articulated. She spoke of her work ethic, her reliability, her willingness to devote herself fully to the demands of the position. He listened without apparent interest, occasionally making a note on the paper before him, his expression never varying from that look of cool assessment. When she had finished, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch into an eternity. Then he began to outline the requirements of the position, and Eleanor understood at once why the salary attached to it was so substantial. The hours would be long and unpredictable, the demands considerable, the tolerance for error non-existent. He would require, he informed her with that same cold directness, complete availability, absolute discretion, and a willingness to subordinate her own needs and preferences to the exigencies of his schedule and temperament. There was something in his tone, in the way he delivered this litany of expectations, that suggested he took a certain satisfaction in the difficulty of what he demanded, as though he relished the power to impose such conditions. Eleanor felt a flicker of resentment, quickly suppressed, and reminded herself that she was in no position to indulge in the luxury of offended dignity. She needed this employment, needed the financial security it represented, and if that required accommodating herself to the whims of an imperious employer, then she would do what necessity demanded. The interview proceeded in this vein for some time, with Thornfield posing questions of increasing specificity, testing her knowledge of various software systems, her familiarity with industry terminology, her ability to think quickly and adapt to changing circumstances. Eleanor answered as well as she could, drawing upon her years of experience in administrative roles, and gradually she began to feel that perhaps she was acquitting herself adequately, that perhaps she had a chance of securing this position despite the obvious gulf between her background and those of the other candidates she had observed in the waiting room. It was as this thought was forming in her mind that the catastrophe occurred. Thornfield had risen from behind his desk and moved to the window, standing with his back to her as he gazed out over the city, and he made some comment about the view, about the perspective one gained from such a vantage point. Eleanor, her nerves somewhat eased by what she perceived as the interview's approaching conclusion, made a response intended to be diplomatic and professional. What she meant to say, what her mind had formulated with perfect clarity, was that the office commanded an impressive prospect, and that one could well understand how such surroundings might contribute to effective decision-making. What emerged from her lips, however, through some terrible accident of tongue and brain, some catastrophic misalignment of intention and execution, was something else entirely. She heard her own voice, as though from a great distance, remarking that yes, the view was quite striking, though she imagined it took a certain type of personality to feel comfortable in such surroundings. Someone who was perhaps hot-headed and arrogant enough to believe they belonged here. The words hung in the air between them like some poisonous vapor, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what she had said. Horror washed over her in waves, rendering her momentarily incapable of speech or movement. Thornfield turned from the window slowly, very slowly, and the expression on his face was one of such utter astonishment that under any other circumstances it might have been comical. His eyebrows had risen nearly to his hairline, his mouth had opened slightly, and for a moment he simply stared at her as though she were some exotic creature whose existence defied all rational explanation. The silence that followed her inadvertent pronouncement was profound and terrible, broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic far below. Eleanor's mind raced frantically, searching for some way to retrieve the situation, some explanation or apology that might mitigate the enormity of her blunder. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words would come. She felt as though she were drowning, sinking beneath the weight of her own mortification, and she watched helplessly as any hope of securing this position, or indeed of ever showing her face in professional circles again, evaporated before her eyes. Then something unexpected happened. Thornfield's expression began to change, the shock giving way to something else, something Eleanor could not immediately identify. The corners of his mouth twitched, then lifted slightly, and suddenly, to her utter amazement, he laughed. It was not a polite chuckle or a forced expression of amusement, but a genuine laugh, deep and unrestrained. And it transformed his face entirely, banishing the coldness and arrogance and revealing beneath them something surprisingly human. He moved back to his desk, still laughing, and lowered himself into his chair with the air of a man who has just witnessed something thoroughly entertaining. He regarded Eleanor with eyes that now held a glimmer of something that might have been respect or interest or perhaps merely curiosity about this strange creature who had dared to insult him to his face. "Hot-headed and arrogant," he repeated, as though tasting the words, and his smile broadened. "Well, Miss Hartley, that is certainly a novel approach to a job interview. I don't believe anyone has ever characterized me quite so directly before, at least not to my face." Eleanor found her voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. She attempted to apologize, to explain that she had not meant, that the words had come out wrong, that she was mortified beyond expression. But Thornfield raised a hand, silencing her attempts at explanation. "Don't," he said, and there was something in his tone that was almost gentle. "Don't apologize for honesty, even when it's accidental. Do you know how rare that is in this world, Miss Hartley? How exhausting it becomes to be surrounded constantly by people who tell you only what they think you want to hear." He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled before him, and studied her with renewed interest. Eleanor, still reeling from the shock of the moment, could only sit and meet his gaze, uncertain what to expect next. "Tell me," he continued, "do you actually believe I'm hot-headed and arrogant? Or was that truly a mistake?" Eleanor hesitated, torn between the desire to salvage what remained of her professional dignity and a strange impulse toward the very honesty he claimed to value. She looked at him, at the man who held her future in his hands, and made a decision that surprised her even as she acted upon it. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that you are accustomed to having your own way, and that you perhaps do not always consider how your manner affects others. Whether that constitutes arrogance or simply the natural consequence of your position, I cannot say." The smile faded from Thornfield's face, replaced by an expression of thoughtful consideration. He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he had long suspected but never quite articulated. "And the hot-headed part?" he asked. "I have no evidence of that," Eleanor admitted. "That was merely a slip of the tongue. You meant to say something else entirely." "I did." "What?" Eleanor felt the heat returning to her cheeks. "I'm not certain I should say." "Oh, you've gone this far, Miss Hartley. You might as well finish the job." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I meant to say that someone would need to be hot and confident to feel comfortable in such surroundings, but the words came out wrong." There was a pause, and then Thornfield's eyebrows rose again. "Hot and confident, which your brain in its panic converted to hot-headed and arrogant. That's quite a transformation." "Yes," Eleanor said miserably. "So you think I'm hot?" Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, wishing the floor would open and swallow her whole. "Mr. Thornfield, I would very much like to leave now and never speak of this again." But when she opened her eyes, she found him regarding her with an expression that was neither mocking nor angry, but rather almost kind, insofar as such a man was capable of kindness. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I'm going to do something I rarely do. I'm going to make a decision based not on credentials or experience, but on character. You have just demonstrated more genuine personality in the last 5 minutes than the previous dozen candidates have shown in their entire lives. You're honest, even when it costs you. You're brave enough to own your mistakes, and you're clearly intelligent, even if your mouth sometimes moves faster than your judgment." He paused, and Eleanor felt her heart begin to pound with a hope she scarcely dared acknowledge. "The position is yours, if you want it," he concluded. "Though I should warn you, working for someone you consider hot-headed and arrogant is likely to be challenging." Eleanor stared at him, unable quite to believe what she was hearing. "You're offering me the job?" "I am." "Despite what I said?" "Because of what you said, Miss Hartley. Or perhaps because of what you didn't say, but thought. I need someone around me who isn't afraid to tell me the truth, even if that truth is unflattering. God knows everyone else in this building is too busy kissing up to me to be of any real use." Eleanor's mind whirled with conflicting emotions, relief, gratitude, disbelief, and a lingering sense that perhaps she had stumbled into something more complicated than a simple employment arrangement. But the practical necessities of her situation overcame her doubts. "I accept," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, his smile returning, but tinged now with something that might have been warning. "You may come to regret this decision." Eleanor's first days at Thornfield Industries passed in a blur of overwhelming information and relentless activity that left her each evening exhausted in both body and spirit. She arrived each morning at 7 o'clock, a full hour before the official start of the workday, and rarely departed before 8 in the evening. And even these extended hours seemed scarcely adequate to the demands placed upon her. The scope of Adrian Thornfield's business interests was vast and bewildering, encompassing real estate developments, technology investments, media holdings, and a dozen other ventures that she struggled to keep organized in her mind. He moved through his days with an energy and focus that seemed almost superhuman, attending meetings, making decisions that involved sums of money Eleanor could scarcely conceptualize, and maintaining a schedule that would have broken a less robust constitution. Miss Chen, who had initially regarded Eleanor with barely concealed skepticism, proved to be an invaluable source of guidance during those first chaotic weeks. The older woman had served Thornfield for 15 years and knew the intricacies of his preferences and requirements with an intimacy that bordered on the uncanny. She could predict his moods, anticipate his needs, and navigate the complex web of corporate relationships that surrounded him with practiced ease. Eleanor learned to defer to her judgment in all matters, recognizing that her own inexperience in such rarefied circles made her vulnerable to countless small errors that might, in aggregate, prove fatal to her continued employment. What surprised Eleanor most, however, was not the volume or complexity of the work, but rather the nature of her employer himself. Adrian Thornfield, she discovered, was not quite the one-dimensional figure of arrogance she had initially supposed. He was certainly demanding, and his standards were exacting to the point of severity, but she began to perceive beneath his cold exterior a mind of remarkable acuity and, occasionally, flashes of something that might almost be termed compassion. He was scrupulously fair in his dealings, never asking of others what he would not demand of himself, and while he had little patience for incompetence or laziness, he showed a surprising willingness to forgive honest mistakes, provided they were not repeated. Their interactions during those early weeks were predominantly professional, conducted in the brisk tones of employer and employee. Yet Eleanor could not help but notice the way his eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she was not observing, or the slight softening in his voice when he addressed her directly. She told herself sternly that she was imagining things, that any appearance of particular interest was merely the natural result of her newness to the position, and that to entertain romantic notions about one's employer was the height of foolishness. Yet, she could not entirely banish from her mind the memory of that first interview, of the way he had looked at her after her disastrous verbal slip, of the unexpected warmth that had briefly illuminated his features. The offices of Thornfield Industries occupied the upper floors of the building, and Eleanor's desk was situated in an alcove adjacent to Adrian's private office, positioned such that she could monitor his comings and goings while maintaining a degree of separation that preserved the hierarchical proprieties. From this vantage point, she observed the steady stream of visitors who sought audience with him. Executives from subsidiary companies, investment bankers with proposals, lawyers with contracts, and an endless parade of petitioners and supplicants, each believing their particular concern to be of paramount importance. She learned to filter these requests, to determine which merited his immediate attention and which could be delegated or deferred, and she took a certain pride in her growing competence in this role. It was during her third week of employment that Eleanor first encountered Victoria Sterling, and the meeting proved to be illuminating in ways both expected and surprising. Miss Sterling arrived without appointment late one afternoon, sweeping past Eleanor's desk with the supreme confidence of one who has never been denied access to anything she desires. She was beautiful in that particular way that requires both excellent genetics and considerable financial investment. Her blonde hair arranged in artful waves, her clothing bearing the unmistakable stamp of haute couture, her manner combining charm and entitlement in equal measure. Eleanor, rising from her desk to intercept this uninvited visitor, found herself waved aside with a gesture of casual dismissal. "I'm sure Adrian is available for me," Victoria announced, her hand already reaching for the door to his office. "We have an understanding." Eleanor, uncertain how to respond to this declaration and conscious of her own junior status, hesitated a moment too long, and Victoria disappeared into the inner sanctum before she could formulate an appropriate objection. She could hear voices from within, first Victoria's light laugh, then Adrian's lower tones, though she could not distinguish the words. She returned to her desk in some confusion, wondering whether she had committed an error in allowing this breach of protocol, and was still contemplating this question when the door opened again, some 20 minutes later, and Victoria emerged, her expression one of satisfied complacency. "You must be new," Victoria observed, pausing at Eleanor's desk and regarding her with the kind of appraising look one might direct at a piece of furniture one is considering purchasing. "Adrian goes through assistance rather quickly, I'm afraid. The work is so demanding and he can be quite particular. I do hope you'll last longer than the previous one. It's so tiresome, constantly having to introduce oneself to new faces." Eleanor, stung by the casual condescension in Victoria's tone, managed a polite smile. "I intend to do my best, Miss Sterling." "Oh, do call me Victoria. We'll be seeing quite a lot of each other, I expect. Adrian and I are very close, you know, have been for years. Some people say we're destined to marry, though of course one never knows about these things until the ring is actually on one's finger." She laughed as though this were a delightful joke. "At any rate, you should know that I'm always to be put through immediately when I call, and I'm never to be kept waiting when I visit. Adrian wouldn't like it if you made me wait." With this pronouncement, delivered with perfect assurance, Victoria swept out, leaving behind a faint trace of expensive perfume and Eleanor's first real sense of the complex personal dynamics that surrounded her employer. She was still processing this encounter when Adrian emerged from his office, his expression thoughtful and, unless she was mistaken, faintly troubled. "Miss Hartley," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her look up sharply. "In future, when Miss Sterling arrives, please do not admit her without checking with me first. I don't care what she claims about our relationship or what access she believes she's entitled to. Standard protocols apply to everyone." Eleanor nodded, relieved that she had not erred as significantly as she had feared, yet puzzled by the evident tension in his voice. "Of course, Mr. Thornfield. I apologize for allowing her to enter unannounced. It's not your fault. Victoria has a way of overriding objections, but you'll learn." He paused, seeming to consider whether to say more, then appeared to think better of it and retreated back into his office, closing the door behind him with more force than was strictly necessary. The incident troubled Eleanor more than she cared to admit, and she found herself thinking about it at odd moments over the following days. She told herself that it was none of her concern if her employer was involved in a romantic relationship, that his personal affairs were entirely separate from her professional duties, yet she could not shake a curious sense of disappointment that seemed to have no rational foundation. She attributed this feeling to her general unsettled state, to the stress of adapting to such demanding employment, and resolved to think no more about the matter. Yet circumstances conspired to make Victoria Sterling a recurring presence in Eleanor's consciousness. The woman called frequently, always with that same expectation of immediate access, and while Eleanor now properly vetted these calls before transferring them, she could not help but overhear fragments of conversation when Adrian's door was ajar. Victoria's voice carried bright and insistent, speaking of social engagements and mutual friends, of charity galas and weekend retreats, painting a picture of a shared world of privilege and leisure that seemed very far removed from Eleanor's own existence. It was Miss Chen who eventually provided context for this relationship during one of their increasingly regular coffee breaks in the small kitchen area reserved for executive staff. The older woman had thawed considerably in her manner toward Eleanor, evidently satisfied that the younger woman was proving competent and unlikely to require rescue from her own incompetence. They had fallen into the habit of taking their afternoon coffee together, and it was during one of these interludes that Eleanor, unable to contain her curiosity, inquired delicately about Miss Sterling. Miss Chen's expression grew knowing. "Ah, Victoria. Yes, she's been a fixture for some time now. Her family moves in the same circles as the Thornfields, you understand? Old money, old connections. She and Mr. Thornfield have known each other since they were children. There's been an understanding for years that they would eventually marry." An understanding? Eleanor's heart sank in a way that she tried very hard not to acknowledge. Not a formal engagement, mind you, but the sort of expectation that develops in certain families. Their marriage would unite two considerable fortunes, consolidate various business interests. It's the way these things are done in their world. Miss Chen paused, stirring her coffee with deliberate care. "Though I will say I've never observed any great passion between them. Affection, certainly, familiarity, but nothing that suggests a great love match." Eleanor absorbed this information in silence, uncertain why it should affect her so profoundly. She had no claim on Adrian Thornfield, no right to feel this curious emptiness at the thought of his marriage to another. He was her employer, nothing more, and the vast gulf that separated their social positions made any other relationship impossible, even to contemplate. Yet she could not deny the small, persistent ache that had lodged itself somewhere in the vicinity of her heart. The days lengthened into weeks, and Eleanor found herself settling into the rhythms of her new life with increasing confidence. She learned the names and faces of the various executives who populated the upper echelons of the company, learned which could be trusted and which bore watching, learned the subtle politics that governed interactions in this corporate realm. She discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she had a talent for the work, that her ability to organize complex information and anticipate needs made her valuable in ways that went beyond mere technical competence. Adrian began to rely on her judgment, to seek her opinion on matters that extended beyond simple administrative tasks, and she felt herself expanding into the role with a sense of satisfaction she had not previously known in her professional life. Yet the more capable she became, the more she found herself drawn into Adrian's world, and the more difficult it became to maintain the proper emotional distance. She was present at meetings where decisions affecting thousands of employees were made with swift certainty, witnessed negotiations where millions of dollars changed hands with a few strokes of a pen, observed the exercise of power in its most concentrated form. And at the center of it all was Adrian himself, brilliant and driven, and utterly committed to his vision of what his empire should become. She began to see past the arrogance she had initially perceived, to recognize it as a kind of armor, a protective shell that concealed depths of feeling he was careful not to reveal. She noticed how his jaw tightened when he was forced to make decisions that would result in job losses, how his voice grew quieter and more controlled when he was most angry, how he sometimes stood at his window in the evening when he thought himself unobserved, staring out at the city with an expression of such weariness and isolation that Eleanor felt an almost overwhelming urge to offer comfort, though she knew such an impulse was entirely inappropriate. There came an evening, some 6 weeks into her employment, when Eleanor was working late to complete a presentation that required Adrian's review before an important meeting the following morning. The office was nearly empty, the usual bustle of daytime activity replaced by the eerie quiet of the after-hours building, and Eleanor was alone with her computer screen and the soft hum of electronic equipment. She had just finished the final slide when Adrian emerged from his office, shrugging into his suit jacket with the evident intention of departing for the evening. He paused when he saw her still at her desk, his expression registering surprise. "Miss Hartley, I didn't realize you were still here. You should have gone home hours ago. I wanted to finish the presentation, Mr. Thornfield. It's ready for your review now, if you have a moment." He moved to stand behind her, leaning over her shoulder to examine the screen, and Eleanor was suddenly intensely aware of his proximity, of the faint scent of his cologne, of the warmth radiating from his body. She forced herself to concentrate on the presentation, walking him through the key points, explaining the data visualizations she had created to support his arguments. She could feel his breath stirring her hair, could sense his attention focused not just on the screen, but on her, and the tension in the air between them seemed to thicken and grow almost palpable. "Excellent work," he said at last, his voice low and carrying a note she could not quite identify. "You have a real gift for this, Eleanor. I don't know how I managed before you arrived." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice sent a small shiver through her. She turned her head slightly to respond, and found herself looking directly into his eyes, which were dark and unreadable in the dim light of the office. For a moment neither of them moved, and Eleanor felt as though the world had contracted to encompass only the small space they occupied, as though everything beyond the circle of lamplight had ceased to exist. Then Adrian straightened abruptly, stepping back as though suddenly conscious of the impropriety of their proximity. "You should go home," he said, his voice now brisk and businesslike, the moment of connection broken as thoroughly as though it had never existed. "It's late, and you'll need your rest. Tomorrow will be demanding." Eleanor, her heart racing in a way that seemed entirely disproportionate to what had actually occurred, gathered her belongings with hands that were not entirely steady. She bid him good night and made her way to the elevator, conscious all the while of his gaze following her retreat. It was only when she was safely enclosed in the descending car that she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had seen in his eyes during that brief, charged moment. Not merely professional appreciation, but something deeper and more dangerous. A reflection of feelings that, if acted upon, could only lead to complications neither of them could afford. The following weeks were marked by a subtle shift in the dynamic between them, a new carefulness in their interactions that suggested both were conscious of boundaries that must not be crossed. Adrian became, if anything, more formal in his manner toward her, addressing her always as Miss Hartley, maintaining a physical distance that sometimes seemed almost exaggerated. Yet Eleanor caught him looking at her when he thought himself unobserved, and she knew that something had changed between them that could not be unchanged, that they were both engaged in a delicate dance of avoidance and acknowledgement, of denial and desire. Victoria Sterling's presence became more frequent during this period, as though she sensed some threat to her presumed claim and sought to reassert her position through sheer force of visibility. She appeared at the office with increasing regularity, always beautifully dressed, always perfectly composed, always treating Eleanor with that same blend of courtesy and condescension that made clear her view of the proper hierarchy of things. Eleanor watched these visits with emotions she struggled to name, observing the easy familiarity between Victoria and Adrian, the way they moved in the same social circles, spoke the same language of privilege and entitlement. It should have been obvious that they belonged together, that Eleanor herself was merely a temporary presence in Adrian's life, a competent employee who would eventually be replaced and forgotten. Yet she could not bring herself to believe this entirely, could not ignore the evidence of her own eyes and instincts. Whatever Adrian's relationship with Victoria might be, it lacked the quality of genuine passion, the spark of true connection. Their interactions were cordial, but curiously bloodless, marked more by habit than by feeling. And when Victoria departed after one of her visits, Eleanor sometimes caught an expression of relief crossing Adrian's features, quickly masked but unmistakable to one who had learned to read his moods. It was during a late November afternoon, with winter's early darkness already gathering outside the windows, that circumstances conspired to bring matters to a head in a way neither Eleanor nor Adrian could have anticipated. An important client meeting had been scheduled, involving Japanese investors whose participation was crucial to a development project Adrian had been cultivating for months. The meeting was to be conducted partly in English and partly through an interpreter, and every detail had been meticulously planned to ensure its success. Eleanor had spent days preparing materials, coordinating schedules, arranging for appropriate refreshments that would demonstrate cultural sensitivity without appearing to pander. She had worked closely with Adrian to ensure he understood the nuances of Japanese business etiquette, the importance of certain formalities, the subtle signals that could make or break such negotiations. Everything had been arranged with painstaking care, and Eleanor felt reasonably confident that the meeting would proceed smoothly. What she had not anticipated was Victoria Sterling's sudden appearance 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, sweeping into the office in a cloud of expensive perfume and announcing that she had come to accompany Adrian to a charity event that evening, an event she insisted he had promised to attend with her. Eleanor, consulting her meticulously maintained calendar, could find no record of such an engagement and attempted to explain that Mr. Thornfield was occupied with crucial business that could not be interrupted. Victoria, however, was not accustomed to being denied. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, with that bright, hard smile that Eleanor had come to recognize as signaling intransigence. "The Ashworth Foundation Gala is tonight, and Adrian knows perfectly well that we're expected to attend together. Everyone will be there. His absence would be noted and remarked upon. I'm certain Mr. Thornfield would have mentioned such an important engagement," Eleanor replied, maintaining her professional composure with effort. "As I said, he has a critical meeting this afternoon that has been scheduled for months. Then he'll have to reschedule it. This is important, and I'm not leaving without him." Victoria moved toward Adrian's office door with evident intention of entering unbidden. Eleanor found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to physically interpose herself between Victoria Sterling and Adrian's office door, an action that required considerably more courage than she would have believed herself to possess. Victoria's expression transformed from one of casual confidence to outright indignation, her carefully maintained veneer of civility cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "I beg your pardon," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a tone of dangerous quiet, "but you seem to have forgotten your place. I don't require permission from an assistant to see Adrian. You would do well to remember that I will be here long after you've moved on to whatever mediocre position you occupy next." The words stung, not least because they contained within them the uncomfortable truth of Eleanor's precarious position. She was, indeed, merely an employee, one who could be dismissed at any moment, whose presence in Adrian's life was temporary and contingent. Yet something in Victoria's manner, in her assumption of automatic superiority, kindled within Eleanor a flame of resistance that would not be easily extinguished. "Mr. Thornfield is preparing for a meeting with investors whose participation is essential to a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I'm certain that even the most important social engagement must take precedence over such business considerations, only if Mr. Thornfield himself determines that to be the case. Perhaps if you would care to wait, I can inform him of your arrival once his current preparations are complete." Victoria's eyes narrowed to slits of blue ice. "I don't believe you understand who you're dealing with. I could have you removed from this building with a single phone call. I could ensure you never work in this city again. Adrian and I have an understanding that clearly transcends anything you, with your limited perspective, could possibly comprehend." It was at this moment, with the situation poised on the knife's edge of disaster, that Adrian's office door opened and the man himself emerged, his expression registering first surprise and then something that looked very much like irritation as he took in the tableau before him. His gaze moved from Victoria's flushed face to Eleanor's carefully controlled features, and Eleanor saw him assess the situation with the same rapid intelligence he brought to all business matters. "Victoria," he said, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "I don't recall us having plans this evening. Perhaps you've confused your schedule." Victoria's expression softened immediately, her anger transforming into something that might have been contrition but looked to Eleanor more like calculated performance. "Darling, surely you remember the Ashworth Gala. We discussed it weeks ago. I have your ticket right here." She produced from her handbag a heavy cream envelope embossed with gold lettering. Adrian accepted the envelope, examined its contents briefly, and then returned it to her with a shake of his head. "I have no recollection of agreeing to attend, and as my assistant has no doubt informed you, I have a critical meeting this evening that cannot be postponed. I'm afraid you'll need to make other arrangements." But Adrian," Victoria protested, her voice taking on a note of pleading that sat oddly with her usual assured manner. "Everyone expects us to appear together. What will people think if you don't attend? What will they say about us?" "They may say whatever they wish. My business obligations take precedence over social appearances. Surely you understand that." Adrian's voice remained courteous but implacable, and Eleanor recognized in it the same quality of absolute finality that he employed in negotiations when he had reached the limit of possible compromise. Victoria's face underwent a remarkable transformation, color flooding her cheeks as she struggled visibly to maintain her composure. "I see," she said at last, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I understand perfectly. Your business is always more important than anything else, than anyone else. How foolish of me to imagine otherwise." She turned to leave, then paused, directing at Eleanor a look of such concentrated venom that Eleanor actually took an involuntary step backward. "You," Victoria said, her voice low and intense, "should be very careful. You may think you understand the situation, but you know nothing. Adrian Thornfield is not a man who forms lasting attachments to people of your class. You're a convenience, nothing more, and you would be wise not to forget it." With this parting shot, Victoria swept from the office, leaving behind a silence that seemed to vibrate with unspoken tensions. Eleanor stood frozen, uncertain whether to acknowledge what had just transpired or to pretend, in accordance with proper professional discretion, that nothing untoward had occurred. It was Adrian who broke the silence, his voice carrying a note of weariness she had not previously heard from him. "Miss Hartley, I apologize for that scene. Victoria can be difficult when she doesn't get her way. I hope she didn't distress you too greatly." Eleanor, gathering her composure, managed a small smile. "I've weathered worse, Mr. Thornfield, though I confess I'm not entirely certain how to categorize what just happened." Adrian moved past her to the window, where he stood gazing out at the city lights beginning to sparkle in the gathering dusk. "Victoria and I have known each other since childhood," he said, as though speaking to himself as much as to her. "Our families have always assumed we would eventually marry, and Victoria has certainly done nothing to discourage that assumption. But I've never made her any promises, never given her reason to believe that such a marriage was inevitable. If she's chosen to interpret my silence as agreement, that's her mistake, not my responsibility." Eleanor listened to this revelation with a heart that seemed to have lodged itself somewhere in her throat. She knew she should say nothing, should maintain the professional distance that was the only safe course, yet she found words emerging despite her better judgment. "She seems very certain of her place in your life, Mr. Thornfield." He turned to face her, and in the dim light of the office, his expression was difficult to read. "Does she? And what place would that be, Miss Hartley? The place she's assigned herself, or the place I've actually offered her?" Eleanor had no answer to this, or rather, she had too many answers, all of them dangerous to articulate. She was saved from the necessity of responding by the arrival of the Japanese delegation, whose punctual appearance returned them both to the safe terrain of professional interaction. Yet as the evening progressed, As she sat in the conference room, taking notes and observing Adrian navigate the complex cultural nuances of the negotiation with impressive skill, Eleanor found her thoughts returning again and again to Victoria's words, to the warning they contained, and to the question of what precisely she herself hoped to gain from this increasingly complicated situation. The meeting concluded successfully well after 9 in the evening, with the Japanese investors expressing satisfaction with the proposed terms and indicating their intention to proceed with the project. Adrian, despite the late hour and the evident exhaustion in his features, insisted on personally escorting their guests to their waiting cars, observing all the proper courtesies with a grace that suggested such gestures cost him nothing, though Eleanor suspected they cost him rather more than he would ever acknowledge. When they were finally alone in the office once more, surrounded by the detritus of the evening's work, Adrian turned to Eleanor with an expression of such unguarded relief that she felt something shift within her chest, some protective barrier beginning to crumble. "Well, Miss Hartley," he said, loosening his tie with a gesture that seemed almost intimate in its casualness, "we seem to have survived another day, though I fear we've made an enemy of Victoria, which may prove costly in ways I'd rather not contemplate." "I'm sorry if my actions contributed to that outcome," Eleanor replied. "Perhaps I should have handled the situation differently." "You handled it perfectly. You protected my business interests and refused to be intimidated by someone who has no actual authority over you. That takes courage, particularly when the person doing the intimidating has the social connections to make your life difficult." He paused, regarding her with an intensity that made her acutely conscious of how alone they were, of how the ordinary rules that governed daylight interactions seemed somehow suspended in this after-hours space. "Tell me something, Eleanor. Are you afraid of her? Of what she might do to harm you?" The use of her first name again, the directness of his question, the way he was looking at her as though her answer mattered to him in ways that transcended professional concern, all of these things combined to strip away Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. She found herself answering with an honesty that surprised her. "I'm afraid of many things, Mr. Thornfield, but Victoria Sterling is not foremost among them. What frightens me more is the possibility of misunderstanding situations, of crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, of allowing my own feelings to cloud my judgment in matters where clarity is essential." The words hung between them, laden with implications that Eleanor immediately wished she could retract. She had said too much, revealed too much, and now there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that their relationship was purely professional. Adrian's expression shifted, something flickering in his eyes that might have been triumph or fear or some complex mixture of both. "And what feelings would those be?" he asked softly, taking a step toward her, then another, until he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the way his chest rose and fell with breathing that seemed less steady than usual. Eleanor knew she should retreat, should laugh off her words as mere exhaustion or stress, should do anything but stand there meeting his gaze with her heart hammering against her ribs. Yet she found herself rooted to the spot, unable or unwilling to flee from whatever was about to happen. "I think you know," she whispered, the words barely audible even in the profound silence of the empty office. Adrian raised his hand, and Eleanor thought for a moment that he meant to touch her face, to draw her closer, to cross that final boundary between employer and employee, between his world and hers. But then his hand fell back to his side, and he stepped away, his expression transforming into something that looked almost like pain. "No," he said, and the word seemed torn from him. "No, this is impossible. You're my employee, Eleanor. There are rules, professional standards, considerations of power and position that make any relationship between us inherently problematic. Not to mention the fact that our backgrounds, our circumstances, our entire lives are so vastly different that any attempt to bridge that gap would be doomed from the start." The rejection, even couched in these rational terms, stung more sharply than Eleanor would have believed possible. She felt heat flood her cheeks, felt the humiliation of having exposed her feelings only to have them dismissed as impossible, impractical, inappropriate. She struggled to find words that would allow her to salvage some shred of dignity from the wreckage of the moment. "Of course," she managed, her voice remarkably steady given the turmoil within. "You're absolutely right. I apologize for my unprofessional behavior. It won't happen again." "Eleanor," Adrian began, reaching toward her as though to stop her retreat, but she was already moving toward the door, gathering her belongings with hands that trembled only slightly, determined to escape before the tears that threatened to overwhelm her could actually fall. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Thornfield," she said, reverting to the formal mode of address with desperate emphasis. "We have the quarterly review meeting at 8, and you'll want to look over the preliminary figures before then. I'll have them on your desk first thing in the morning." She fled before he could respond, her feet carrying her swiftly to the elevator, through the empty lobby, out into the cold November night that seemed to match perfectly the chill that had settled around her heart. It was only when she was safely on the subway, surrounded by strangers who cared nothing for her distress, that she allowed herself to acknowledge the full extent of what had just occurred. She had offered her heart, or something very like it, and had been rejected on grounds that were entirely reasonable and entirely crushing. Adrian Thornfield had made clear that whatever attraction might exist between them could never be acted upon, that the barriers of class and position that separated them were insurmountable. Eleanor spent a sleepless night alternating between humiliation at her own foolishness and anger at the circumstances that made such feelings inappropriate. By morning, she had resolved to approach the situation with the same pragmatism that Adrian himself had demonstrated. She would continue in her position, would perform her duties with the same competence she had shown thus far, and would carefully suppress any personal feelings that threatened to interfere with her professional conduct. If Adrian could maintain appropriate distance, then so could she. If he could treat their interaction as merely an awkward moment to be forgotten, then she would do likewise. Yet when she arrived at the office the following morning, determined to implement this resolution, she found Adrian already at his desk, looking as though he had slept as poorly as she had. He glanced up when she entered, and the expression in his eyes was one of such complex emotion that Eleanor felt her careful composure waver. "Eleanor," he said, rising from his chair, "we need to talk about last night." "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Thornfield," she replied, moving to her desk and beginning to arrange the materials for the morning meeting with hands that were perfectly steady through sheer force of will. "You were right to point out the inappropriateness of any personal relationship between us. I appreciate your directness, and I assure you it won't affect my work performance." "That's not what he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with how to proceed. "I handled that badly. I shouldn't have been so abrupt, so categorical in my rejection. The truth is more complicated than I made it seem." Eleanor continued her preparations without looking at him, afraid that meeting his gaze would undo her fragile self-control. "Mr. Thornfield, I would really prefer not to revisit last night's conversation. You made your position clear, and I respect it. Let's simply move forward as though nothing happened." "But something did happen," Adrian insisted, his voice taking on an urgency that compelled her attention, despite her determination to avoid this discussion. "Something has been happening between us for weeks, and pretending otherwise isn't going to make it go away. I'm attracted to you, Eleanor, more than attracted. I think about you constantly, find myself looking for excuses to call you into my office, count the hours until you arrive each morning. But acting on those feelings would be unconscionable given the power imbalance between us, given that your employment depends on my goodwill, given 100 other considerations that make any romantic relationship between us ethically complicated at best." Eleanor finally allowed herself to look at him, to really see him, and what she saw in his face was a reflection of her own conflicted emotions, desire warring with duty, hope struggling against pragmatism, the human heart rebelling against the dictates of reason. She felt her resolution weakening, felt herself drawn toward him, despite all the sensible reasons she should maintain her distance. "What are you suggesting?" she asked quietly. "That we simply endure these feelings in silence, that we torture ourselves with what might be possible in some other circumstance, some other life, where the barriers between us don't exist." "I don't know," Adrian admitted, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. "I don't have answers, Eleanor. I only know that pushing you away last night felt like the worst kind of betrayal, like denying something essential and true because it's inconvenient or complicated. But I also know that I don't want to be the kind of man who takes advantage of his position, who uses the power he holds over an employee's livelihood to extract personal favors or emotional intimacy." The morning sunlight streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the office, and in that clear light, Eleanor saw with painful clarity the dimensions of the problem that confronted them. There was no easy solution, no path forward that didn't involve either suppressing genuine feeling or violating professional ethics. They stood at an impasse, each recognizing the legitimacy of the other's concerns, neither willing to simply dismiss the connection that had developed between them. It was Miss Chen's arrival that broke the spell. Her appearance at the office door with a sheaf of documents requiring immediate attention, returning them both to the reality of the working day. Adrian retreated to his office, and Eleanor bent to her tasks with a determination that bordered on desperation, seeking refuge in work from the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm her. Yet, throughout that long day, she was conscious of his presence in the adjacent room, conscious of the unfinished conversation that hung between them like a weight, conscious that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship that could not be shifted back. The following weeks were marked by a tension that pervaded every interaction between Eleanor and Adrian, a consciousness of unspoken feelings that made even the most mundane exchanges fraught with significance. They maintained the forms of professional propriety with scrupulous care, yet beneath the surface civility there ran a current of emotion that neither could entirely suppress. Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of his presence, of the timbre of his voice, of the way his hand moved across documents as he signed them, of 1,000 small details that should have been beneath notice, but which now seemed charged with meaning. The approach of the winter holidays brought with it a flurry of social obligations that required Eleanor's coordination, and it was in the management of these events that she gained new insight into Adrian's world and the expectations that governed it. There were corporate parties to arrange, charity functions to attend, countless gatherings where Adrian's presence was required not merely as a successful businessman, but as a representative of his family's position in society. Victoria Sterling appeared at many of these functions, always impeccably dressed, always at Adrian's side, always projecting an image of coupled unity that Eleanor found increasingly difficult to witness. Yet she observed that Adrian seemed to endure rather than enjoy these occasions, that his smiles during such events held a quality of performance rather than genuine pleasure, that he often stood slightly apart from Victoria even when they appeared together, maintaining a physical distance that suggested emotional remoteness. Eleanor, attending some of these functions in her capacity as his assistant, watched these interactions with a mixture of pain and something that might have been hope, wondering whether the understanding between Adrian and Victoria was as solid as Victoria claimed, or as fragile as Adrian's behavior suggested. It was at the annual Thornfield Industries Holiday Gala, held in a grand ballroom overlooking the city, that matters came to a head in a manner neither Eleanor nor Adrian could have anticipated. The event was elaborate even by the standards of corporate excess, with hundreds of employees and important clients in attendance, champagne flowing freely, an orchestra providing music for dancing, and decorations that transformed the space into something resembling a winter palace. Eleanor had spent weeks organizing every detail, ensuring that the evening would reflect well on the company and its leadership, and she moved through the crowd with a sense of professional satisfaction at seeing her careful planning come to fruition. She had dressed for the occasion in a gown borrowed from a former college roommate, a simple but elegant dress of deep green that complemented her coloring and lent her an air of sophistication she did not entirely feel she possessed. She told herself that she had taken such care with her appearance, purely for professional reasons, that it had nothing to do with any desire to be seen by Adrian in a context outside their usual office interactions. Yet she could not entirely suppress a small flutter of anticipation at the thought of his seeing her thus attired. Adrian himself looked magnificent in formal evening wear, the severe black and white of his clothing emphasizing the strong lines of his features and lending him an air of austere elegance. Victoria was at his side, resplendent in a gown that probably cost more than Eleanor earned in several months, her hand possessively on his arm, her manner that of a woman secure in her position. Eleanor, observing them from across the room, felt the familiar ache of impossibility settle around her heart. The evening progressed with all the expected rituals. Speeches were made, toasts offered, business relationships reinforced through social interaction. Eleanor circulated among the guests, ensuring that various executives were introduced to important clients, that dietary restrictions were accommodated, that the myriad small crises that inevitably arose at such events were handled with discretion and efficiency. She was engaged in resolving a conflict between the catering staff and the facilities manager when she became aware of a disturbance near the center of the ballroom. Voices raised in anger cutting through the general hum of conversation. She turned to see Victoria Sterling confronting Adrian with an expression of fury that made no concession to their public setting. Eleanor could not hear the words from this distance, but the body language was unmistakable. Accusation, denial, escalating emotion. Other guests were beginning to notice, conversations faltering as attention turned toward this unexpected drama. Eleanor felt a surge of alarm, knowing that such a scene could damage Adrian's reputation and the company's standing, and she moved quickly through the crowd toward the source of the conflict. As she drew closer, fragments of the argument became audible. Victoria's voice, normally so carefully modulated, had risen to a pitch of barely controlled hysteria. "How dare you humiliate me this way? How dare you make a fool of me in front of everyone who matters? I've been patient, I've been understanding, I've tolerated your moods and your obsession with work, but this is beyond endurance." Adrian's response was quieter but no less intense. "Victoria, this is neither the time nor the place for this conversation. If you have grievances, we can discuss them privately." "Privately? So you can dismiss me again, tell me I'm imagining things, make me feel as though I'm being unreasonable for expecting basic respect and consideration. No, Adrian. I'm tired of being put off, tired of being treated as though my feelings don't matter, tired of watching you moon over your little assistant while I'm expected to smile and pretend everything is fine." The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow, and she froze mid-stride, suddenly the focus of dozens of curious gazes as people followed Victoria's gesture and looked toward her. She felt heat flood her face, felt the weight of judgment and speculation from all sides, felt herself becoming the subject of exactly the kind of gossip she had most wished to avoid. Adrian's expression had gone cold and hard in a way Eleanor had never seen before. "That's enough, Victoria. Whatever issues you and I may have, Eleanor has nothing to do with them. She's done nothing wrong, and I won't have you attacking her to score points in an argument that has nothing to do with her." Nothing to do with her?" Victoria laughed, a sound without humor. "She has everything to do with it. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I haven't seen the way you look at her, the way you've changed since she arrived? You used to at least pretend to care about maintaining our relationship, about honoring the understanding between our families. But ever since she walked through your door, you've barely been able to tolerate my presence." Eleanor knew she should retreat, should remove herself from this scene before it deteriorated further, yet she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from Adrian's face as Victoria's words washed over them both. What she saw there was a kind of weary resignation, as though he had finally reached the limit of his patience with a situation he had allowed to persist far too long. "There is no understanding between us, Victoria," Adrian said, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom with devastating clarity. "There never has been. That's a fiction created by our families and perpetuated by your refusal to accept reality. I've never proposed to you, never promised you marriage, never given you any reason to believe that such a union was inevitable. If you've chosen to build your expectations on foundations of wishful thinking rather than actual commitment, that's not my responsibility." Victoria swayed as though struck, her face draining of color. "You're saying this now? Here? In front of all these people? You're going to throw away everything we've built, everything our families expect, for some insignificant nobody who happened to catch your eye because she's different from the women you usually meet?" "I'm saying," Adrian continued, his tone softening slightly but losing none of its firmness, "what I should have said years ago. We don't belong together, Victoria. We never did. We're compatible only in the most superficial ways, and that's not enough foundation for a life together. You deserve someone who loves you with the kind of passion and devotion I simply don't feel. And I deserve the freedom to pursue happiness with someone I actually choose, rather than someone chosen for me by circumstance and expectation." The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound and terrible. Eleanor stood frozen, conscious of being at the center of a drama not of her making, uncertain whether Adrian's words represented a declaration of intention toward her or merely a rejection of Victoria's presumptions. Victoria herself seemed momentarily incapable of speech, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, her carefully maintained composure shattered beyond repair. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Adrian. Both of you will regret this. My family has considerable influence in this city, and I promise you that there will be consequences for this public humiliation. As for you," she turned to Eleanor, her eyes glittering with malice, "I hope you're satisfied with yourself. I hope whatever you think you've gained was worth destroying what could have been built between two families of actual consequence." She swept from the ballroom with what dignity she could muster, leaving behind a buzz of excited conversation and speculation. Adrian stood for a moment as though gathering himself, then turned to address the assembled guests with remarkable composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for that unpleasant scene. These matters are always difficult, but they're better addressed honestly than allowed to fester. I hope you'll continue to enjoy the evening." He gestured to the orchestra, which after a moment's hesitation resumed playing, and gradually the normal rhythms of the party reasserted themselves, though Eleanor could feel the weight of curious gazes following her as she attempted to retreat to the relative safety of the periphery. She had nearly reached the exit when Adrian's hand on her arm stopped her. "Eleanor, wait, please." She turned to face him, conscious of the eyes still watching them, conscious that whatever they said or did in this moment would be dissected and discussed and transformed into gossip. "Mr. Thornfield, I think it would be best if I left. My presence here is clearly causing difficulties." "Your presence is the only thing making this bearable," Adrian replied, his voice low and urgent. "Eleanor, I know this isn't the time or place I would have chosen for this conversation, but Victoria's outburst has rather forced my hand. I meant what I said to her. I don't love her, never have loved her, and can't continue to pretend otherwise merely to satisfy familial expectations." "That's between you and her," Eleanor said, though her heart was racing in a way that suggested she understood his words as more than mere rejection of Victoria. "It has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you," Adrian insisted, his hand tightening on her arm. "Do you think I would have finally ended that farce if not for you? Do you think I would have found the courage to defy expectations and disappoint my family if I hadn't met someone who made me realize what I'd been missing, what I'd been settling for in accepting the path laid out for me? Eleanor looked at him, at the man who held such power over her professional life and, if she were honest with herself, over her heart as well. She saw in his face vulnerability she had not seen before, a kind of desperate hope that mirrored her own feelings. Yet she could not forget the obstacles that still stood between them, could not ignore the complications that would arise from any romantic relationship between them. "Adrian," she said, using his given name for the first time in public, "even if what you're saying is true, even if you do have feelings for me, that doesn't solve the fundamental problems we discussed. I'm still your employee. The power imbalance between us still exists. Whatever gossip Victoria's scene may have started will only intensify if we're seen to be involved." "Then you're fired," Adrian said, and at Eleanor's look of shock, he clarified with the ghost of a smile. "Effective 2 weeks from now, which should satisfy any concerns about improper use of position. I'll provide excellent references, of course, and enough severance to support you while you seek other employment. Or if you prefer, I can arrange a position for you in another division of the company, one where I'll have no direct authority over you. The point is, Eleanor, I'm not going to let administrative concerns stand in the way of something that feels more real and more right than anything I've experienced before." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was offering, by the demonstration of commitment represented by his willingness to restructure professional arrangements to accommodate personal feelings. Yet doubt still lingered, the product of a lifetime of understanding her place in the social hierarchy, of knowing that fairy tale romances between assistants and millionaire bosses belonged in the realm of fiction rather than reality. "Your family will never accept me," she said quietly. "I don't come from your world, don't understand its rules and expectations. Victoria was right about that much at least. I'm nobody of consequence, nobody who would enhance your position or satisfy your family's ambitions for strategic alliances." Adrian cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "My family will accept whomever I choose to bring into my life, or they'll learn to live with disappointment. I'm tired of living for other people's expectations, Eleanor. I'm tired of suppressing what I feel because it doesn't fit neatly into predetermined categories. I'm 35 years old, successful by any objective measure, and utterly miserable in every way that actually matters. Then you walked into my office and called me hot-headed and arrogant, and somehow that moment of brutal honesty opened a door I didn't even know existed." Eleanor laughed despite herself, remembering that disastrous interview that now seemed to have occurred in another lifetime. "I still maintain that was an accident. The best accidents often are," Adrian replied, and then, seemingly heedless of their audience, of the scandal that would inevitably follow, of every obstacle and complication that still lay before them, he kissed her. The ballroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations, but Eleanor was conscious of none of it. She was aware only of Adrian's mouth on hers, of his arms around her, of the feeling that she had finally come home after a long journey through alien territory. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw in his eyes a reflection of her own joy and terror, an overwhelming sense of rightness. "Well," she said when she could speak again, "I suppose that's one way to handle workplace romance concerns." "I've always favored direct action over prolonged deliberation," Adrian replied, his smile transforming his features from austere to almost boyish. "Though I'll admit this particular decision may have been somewhat impulsive." "Somewhat?" Eleanor laughed. "Adrian, you just publicly ended one relationship and began another in the space of 10 minutes, in front of most of your employees and half the business community of the city. I'm not certain impulsive quite covers it." "Then you'll have to help me manage the fallout," he said, growing serious. "Because I meant what I said, Eleanor. I want this, want you, want a life that's about more than quarterly earnings and strategic acquisitions. But I also know I'm asking you to step into a world that may not always be welcoming, that comes with scrutiny and expectations you never sought. If you're not ready for that, if you need time to consider, I'll understand." Eleanor looked around the ballroom, at the faces watching them with expressions ranging from approval to disapproval to simple curiosity. She thought of the comfortable predictability of her old life, of the safety of modest expectations and circumscribed ambitions. Then she looked back at Adrian, at the man who had somehow become essential to her happiness in the space of a few short months, and she realized that the choice before her was no choice at all. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I have no idea how to navigate your world, no confidence that I'll be able to meet the standards that will be applied to me. No certainty that this won't all end in disaster. But I also know that I've never felt more alive than I have since meeting you, that you've awakened something in me I didn't know existed, and that I'd rather face an uncertain future with you than a safe, predictable one without you." Adrian's expression transformed into something that could only be described as radiant joy. He pulled her close again, holding her as though she were something precious and fragile, and Eleanor felt the last of her reservations dissolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they would face them together. It was not the ending she had imagined when she first walked into his office, nervous and uncertain and completely unprepared for the way her life was about to change. But as she stood in his arms, surrounded by the curious and the judgmental and the genuinely happy, she found herself thinking that perhaps the best stories were the ones that defied expectation, that took unpredictable turns, that ended not in neat resolution, but in the promise of continued adventure. Miss Chen appeared at Eleanor's elbow some time later, after the party had resumed its normal rhythms and Eleanor and Adrian had retreated to a quieter corner of the ballroom. The older woman's expression was inscrutable, and Eleanor braced herself for criticism or warning. Instead, Miss Chen smiled, a genuine expression that softened her usually stern features. "Well, Miss Hartley," she said, "I must say you've certainly made your mark on Thornfield Industries. In all my years here, I've never seen anyone shake up the established order quite so thoroughly." "I hope I haven't caused too many problems," Eleanor replied uncertainly. "Problems? My dear, you've solved the biggest problem of all. Mr. Thornfield has been sleepwalking through his life for years, going through the motions expected of him without any real engagement or joy. You've woken him up. Whatever complications may arise from tonight's events, that's a gift beyond price." She patted Eleanor's hand with unexpected warmth. "Besides, working for a happy employer is considerably more pleasant than working for a miserable one. So from a purely selfish perspective, I'm grateful to you." In the weeks that followed, Eleanor discovered that Miss Chen's prediction about complications was entirely accurate. The gossip about the holiday gala spread through business and social circles with remarkable speed, and Eleanor found herself the subject of speculation and judgment from quarters she had never even known existed. Some people were genuinely supportive, seeing in their story a romantic narrative worth celebrating. Others were less kind, viewing Eleanor as an opportunist who had somehow ensnared a wealthy man through calculation rather than genuine feeling. Victoria Sterling's family did indeed attempt to make difficulties, using their considerable influence to damage Adrian's reputation and business prospects, though these efforts were largely unsuccessful, given Adrian's own substantial resources and connections. The professional rearrangements Adrian had promised were implemented with impressive speed. Eleanor was offered and accepted a position as Director of Strategic Communications in a division of Thornfield Industries that operated independently of Adrian's direct oversight, a role that utilized her skills while eliminating concerns about improper power dynamics. The separation was difficult at first, as they had grown accustomed to working in close proximity, but they adapted, finding new rhythms that allowed them to maintain professional integrity while exploring their personal relationship. Adrian's family reacted to the news of their relationship with predictable disapproval, his mother expressing concerns about Eleanor's background and suitability, his father worrying about the business implications of alienating the Sterling family. Yet Adrian held firm, making clear that his choice of partner was not subject to negotiation or approval, and gradually, faced with his determination, his family began to soften. Eleanor's first dinner with the Thornfields was an ordeal she would never forget. Sitting in their magnificent home, surrounded by generations of wealth and privilege, conscious of every potential social error, every lapse in the etiquette she had learned hastily from online resources. Yet she survived the evening, and subsequent encounters grew progressively easier as she learned to navigate the peculiar customs of this world she had entered. There were adjustments required on both sides. Adrian had to learn that Eleanor valued independence and would not be content to simply occupy the role of decorative companion. Eleanor had to learn that accepting help was not the same as surrendering autonomy, that allowing Adrian to use his resources to smooth certain paths did not diminish her own accomplishments. They argued about these matters, sometimes heatedly, and Eleanor discovered that Adrian could indeed be hot-headed when sufficiently provoked, though she found this quality oddly endearing rather than off-putting. 6 months after the holiday gala, Adrian took Eleanor to dinner at an exclusive restaurant overlooking the city, the same city that had seemed so intimidating when she first arrived at Thornfield Industries. They talked about her work, about his latest acquisition, about a trip they were planning to take together, about all the ordinary matters that occupy couples learning to build a life together. It was only when dessert arrived that Adrian grew serious, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Eleanor," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, without consideration for what you think I want to hear." Eleanor felt her heart rate accelerate, sensing the significance of whatever was coming. "Of course. Are you happy? Truly happy? I know the last 6 months have been difficult in ways you didn't anticipate when you agreed to take a chance on us. You've been subjected to gossip and judgment, forced to adapt to a world that wasn't always welcoming, asked to make compromises and adjustments you never sought. I need to know whether it's been worth it, whether I've brought more joy or more burden into your life." Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had somehow become her home, her anchor, her best self's inspiration. She thought about the journey that had brought her from that terrifying interview to this moment, about all the unexpected turns and complications and revelations along the way. "Adrian," she said, squeezing his hand, "I called you hot-headed and arrogant on the day we met, and I've spent the last 9 months discovering that I was both entirely wrong and somehow exactly right. You can be impossible and infuriating and utterly exasperating. You're demanding and driven and sometimes thoughtless about how your actions affect others. But you're also brilliant and generous and capable of surprising kindness. You've challenged me to become more than I thought I could be, supported me in ways I didn't know I needed, and loved me with an intensity that sometimes takes my breath away. So yes, I'm happy, deliriously, terrifyingly, absolutely happy." Adrian smiled. That transformation of his features that Eleanor had learned meant she had somehow managed to surprise him, despite his best efforts to anticipate her responses. "Good," he said. "That's very good, because I was rather hoping you'd be willing to make this permanent." He produced from his jacket pocket a small velvet box, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a ring that managed to be both elegant and understated, clearly expensive, yet somehow perfectly suited to her taste rather than ostentatious display of wealth. "Marry me, Eleanor," Adrian said, not as a question but as a statement of intention, as though he had already decided that this was how their story would continue, and was merely waiting for her confirmation of what he already knew to be true. "Marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that the best decision I ever made was hiring the woman who had the courage to insult me to my face." Eleanor laughed through the tears that had begun streaming down her face, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming gratitude for the strange series of accidents and choices that had brought her to this moment. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course, yes. Though I maintain that calling you hot-headed and arrogant was entirely accidental." "The best things usually are," Adrian replied, sliding the ring onto her finger and pulling her close for a kiss that was witnessed by the entire restaurant staff and several dozen fellow diners, none of whose reactions Eleanor cared about in the slightest. They were married 6 months later in a ceremony that managed to satisfy both Adrian's family's expectations and Eleanor's preference for relative simplicity, a balance achieved through compromise and negotiation and mutual willingness to prioritize what actually mattered over adherence to tradition for its own sake. Miss Chen attended, offering Eleanor advice and encouragement with the warmth of a surrogate mother. Even Victoria Sterling sent a gift, a gesture that Eleanor chose to interpret as tacit acknowledgement that perhaps things had worked out for the best for everyone involved. Eleanor never entirely forgot the circumstances of their meeting, the disastrous interview that had somehow ended in employment rather than humiliation. It became a story they told at dinner parties, a tale that evolved in the telling but always retained its essential truth, that sometimes the worst mistakes could lead to the best outcomes, that honesty, even accidental, could be the foundation for genuine connection, and that the barriers of class and circumstance that seemed so insurmountable were, in the end, merely obstacles to be overcome rather than absolute limitations on what was possible. Years later, when Eleanor held their first child in her arms and watched Adrian's face transform with wonder and terror and overwhelming love, she thought back to that November morning when she had stood before Thornfield Industries, uncertain and anxious, and completely unprepared for how her life was about to change. She had been afraid then, afraid of failure, afraid of judgment, afraid of revealing herself as inadequate to the demands that would be placed upon her. What she had not known, what she could not have known, was that the greatest rewards often came wrapped in the greatest risks, that the most profound connections often emerged from the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes calling your future husband hot-headed and arrogant was, against all probability, exactly the right thing to do.